Hello, it's 1600 hours GMT. I'm Nick Clark. You're watching Al Jazeera's extensive coverage of the war between the United States, Israel and Iran. Coming up, Donald Trump says Iran's president has asked for a ceasefire, but Washington will only consider it if the Strait of Hormuz is open. Tehran denies President Trump's claims. Iran tells Al Jazeera it did not request a ceasefire, while the US and Israel continue to bomb the country. Israel under fire. At least 25 people have been injured in Israel as strikes hit multiple sites in and around Tel Aviv. In other news, the US Supreme Court considers Donald Trump's efforts to limit birthright citizenship. The president is attending the session. So, US President Donald Trump is making a stark declaration ahead of addressing the nation later on Tuesday. He says Iran has asked for a ceasefire. Posting on social media, Trump said Washington will consider the offer once the Strait of Hormuz is open, free and clear. Until then, quotes, US forces are blasting Iran into oblivion, he said. But Iranian officials have told Al Jazeera those diplomatic conversations have not taken place and deny asking for a ceasefire, despite Trump's claims. So it's not clear yet if those talks did or did not take place. What is clear, though, is the continued attacks throughout the Middle East by Iran, the United States and Israel. All right, we're covering this story across the globe this hour. We'll talk to our correspondents in Dubai, in the occupied West Bank, in Riyadh, in Washington, D.C., and indeed in Tehran, which is where we start with Ali Hashim. So, Ali, are we hearing anything from the Iranian leadership on Donald Trump's statement?
Well, what we heard is that they've not said this. They've not asked for a ceasefire, and they are actually repeating this, saying that the only thing that they are looking for is a comprehensive end to this one. We just refer to what's the possible source President Trump derived his conclusion from. It could be the President Pezeshkian, the Iranian President Pezeshkian's a conversation with the head of the European Council, where he said that Iran wants this to come to an end, but with a clear guarantee that this is not going to be repeated. So this could be the source where President Trump derived his conclusion. However, the Iranians are saying this is not the case. Yesterday, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi repeated that his country is not looking for a ceasefire, and also it's looking mainly for a comprehensive end. Plus, if this is going to be the case, what about other main cases on the table? What about the Strait of Hormuz? What about the Iranian uranium, highly enriched uranium? And what about the regional security, especially after the rift between Iran and its Gulf neighbors, after launching rockets and drones towards these countries? How the relation is going to be? The most important thing, what's the fate of the Israeli-Iranian war? Will it continue? Just like when President Trump announced a ceasefire with the Houthis, when they, without having the Israelis in this ceasefire, and the war continued between the two sides. With the war continued between the Iranians and the Israelis, and in Lebanon and in Yemen. Very big questions are being asked now, especially that there is a speech everyone is waiting, and there are a lot of leaks coming here and there, reports that President Trump is going to link his ceasefire offer to opening the Strait of Hormuz. So is the opening of Strait of Hormuz the end game for this war? Is a big question.
All right, from Tehran to the White House, Alan Fisher, our chief US correspondent, standing by there. And indeed, Alan, in theory, we should learn more later as Donald Trump addresses the nation.
But I don't think we're likely to get any indication of where this possible ceasefire idea has come from. Certainly the markets are responding well, and many people will say that it was a cynical move by Donald Trump to do exactly that. They're up over trading in the last couple of hours. When we found out that Donald Trump was likely to have going to have a national address, still pretty rare for presidents to do that, the speculation was that he would announce that the war was going to end. I battered the phones late on Tuesday, early on Wednesday, and they said that's not where we're going. In the last couple of hours, Donald Trump has spoken to Reuters. He says he's going to talk about how he's deeply disappointed with NATO and is considering withdrawing from the alliance. Sidebar, he can't. He's got to get congressional approval for that. He is going to suggest that the time in Iran is going to be relatively short. He's talked about a 4 to 6 week window, so maybe another 2 weeks, or according to an interview he gave on Tuesday, 2 weeks and another couple of days on the end of that. And he'll retain forces in the region so that he can have spot strikes on Iran if he thinks they're about to produce a threat to either regional allies, including Israel, or the United States itself. Donald Trump is aware that his poll ratings are way down. Support for the war is way down. There's a feeling in the White House that the message isn't getting out to the wider American public, that there is going to be short-term pain economically for the long-term gain of a more stable Middle East and a nuclear-free Iran. And that is what they're hoping to do with the address that we'll get in about 9 hours' time. He's hoping to break through to the American people and say, look, we've had all this military success. Bear with us. The economic success will follow soon after.
All right, Alan, thanks for that. Alan Fisher there. The wide weeks may be a critical test for Israel, which has shown no indication of winding down its operations. Nora Day is following developments in Israel from near Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. So, Nora, what's the view from Israel, given that there are still strikes right across the country?
Well, we'd have to talk about two kinds of views, Nick. One, the government, which, as you said, is not interested in a ceasefire, does not want this war to end at this point, at least. And as it is continuing, Israel is trying to maximize the benefit, so to speak. So it is escalating its strikes. It's changing its targets to more strategic ones, like the steel factories, the pharmaceutical companies, the universities, and so on, because it does not want to give Iran the possibility of recovery when and if the war ends. Now, if you're, for ordinary Israelis, talking about ending the war at this point might seem like welcome news, because just today, just in the past 24 hours, Israelis have had to go to the shelters for more than a dozen times because of Iranian missiles. And that's not to speak of the Hezbollah rockets, which have not stopped targeting northern communities and northern cities like Nahariya and Haifa and Safad. So we've seen 29 people injured in the first volley in the afternoon from Iranian missiles in the larger Tel Aviv area. In the evening, 6 times the sirens went off. A building in Tahtikva is said to have collapsed, and there are 10 different impact sites across that central area in Israel where 44% of the population lives. So we're talking about millions of people who had to basically hunker down in shelters for a very long time today, Nick.
No, thanks for that, Nora Day there near Ramallah. So, Ali, back to you in Tehran. Missiles hitting Israel, but of course also hitting Iran, and Iran's industrial bases have been struck.
Well, indeed, yeah. Actually, even a couple of hours ago, there have been a couple of attacks here in Iran to the east, in Tehran to the east of the capital. Over the past hours, we've heard of another attack on a steel factory. A lot of concentration on factories, industries, pharmaceuticals like yesterday. And this is having also its own reflection on and impact on the Iranian people, especially when it comes to, for example, pharmaceuticals. Now, when it comes to industrial targets, this is also creating a situation where the Iranians are retaliating towards industrial targets in the Gulf and in Israel. And, you know, this is becoming a vicious cycle that's not really possible to stop, at least for now.
Ali, thanks for that. Ali Hashem there in Tehran. Kuwait says its international airport has been hit by a drone attack targeting fuel tanks. Officials say the latest strike caused a large fire and damaged fuel storage facilities at the airport. The fire is out now, and there are no reports of injuries. And a tanker leased by Qatar Energy has been damaged off the coast of Qatar after being hit by a projectile. The British Maritime Monitoring Agency said the incident happened about 30 kilometres north of the industrial city of Ras Laffan. Let's cross to Zain Basravi in Dubai. So, Zain, no let-ups, it seems, in attacks across the Gulf.
That is correct. Every time there's an attack in one of these cities in the GCC region, it just cements a little deeper the fact that they are truly on the front line of this conflict. Maybe not a ground war yet, and hopefully it won't go there, but in terms of naval attacks, in terms of aerial attacks, the GCC was roped into this war unwillingly from day one, and it has become a semi-permanent front line, and that's the fear of GCC leaders with every one of these attacks. Let's just look at the events today. Here in Kuwait, of course, it's the second time in as many weeks that there's been a fuel tank fire from an attack at the Kuwait International Airport. It's perhaps a silver lining that they were able to put this one out so quickly. The last time it took almost 3 days for them to put out that fire. Kuwait's International Airport, other international airports, major hubs in this region, consistently targeted as part of Iran's retaliation against targets in the GCC. In Qatar, the defense ministry is saying that at least 3 missiles were launched at Qatar from Iran today. 2 were intercepted. 1, of course, hit the Aqwa 1 oil tanker leased by state-owned Qatar Energy. Qatar Energy saying that this incident happened about 31 kilometers north of that major LNG hub at Ras Laffan that was hit in days previous and is currently offline. Now, we know that that vessel was hit on the port side above the waterline, and there was some risk of a projectile that remained unexploded in the engine room, but we know that there hasn't been any developments since. No injuries. The 21-person crew was evacuated safely, and there hasn't been any environmental incidents since then. Elsewhere, we do know that, of course, in the UAE, there have been multiple attacks today. The latest report being put out by the Ministry of Defense saying they confronted 5 ballistic missiles and 35 drones on separate occasions. The UAE has seen the largest number of attacks of all of the GCC countries by Iran. Elsewhere in Fujairah, debris fall killed a worker on a farm in Rifah area of Fujairah, and Al Quwain, someone was injured as well from debris fall. In Bahrain, there was a facility belonging to a private company that was damaged. IRGC putting out a statement saying that they attacked military personnel of the United States there, but no confirmation of that, but they are claiming that's what that attack may have been. Again, we're waiting for confirmation on anything like that. Saudi Arabia confronting multiple drone attacks as well, and really this carries on day after day. The consistency of these attacks is something that is becoming very worrying for GCC leaders as this conflict enters into its 5th week.
And Zain, of course, flights have been happening, but we're now hearing of flight restrictions being imposed on Iranian nationals by the UAE.
That is correct. What we're hearing from airlines here in Dubai, Emirates, Fly Dubai, saying that Iranian nationals will not be allowed to transit through or enter the United Arab Emirates. Now, there were murmurs of this in recent days. The statement on the Emirates website really putting a fine line under what seems to be policy now for Iranian travelers. The website says only Iranians with a golden visa for the UAE, senior professionals, athletes, and family members of Emirati citizens will be allowed to enter the UAE. Otherwise, transiting and entering the UAE for Iranian nationals, a diaspora which is very wide, very culturally entrenched in the Emirates for some time, they will no longer be allowed here. And what we understand is more than 1,200 Iranian citizens have left the UAE since the war began. Really what this is a reflection of how in times of conflict, borders don't just become hardened, they become selective. And what we are seeing now is the shifting of policy based on a heightened security stance by the internal security apparatus, not just of the UAE, but of multiple GCC countries. That hardening of the security stance is beginning to affect the lives of people who are trying to move around this region.
Zain Basravi there in Dubai. Thank you. And now to Ressel Soda in Riyadh. And Ressel, so Trump's comments have refocused this US goal to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. How integral is this for Gulf nations?
Well, indeed. So the Gulf nations are extremely interested in this and want it to be materialized because this is the biggest threat that the GCC's economic stability and the energy strategy is facing since its formation in 1981. just since the beginning of the war on, more than 400 million barrels of oil were removed from the global market. This is quite huge. And just before the war, the 20% of the global crude oil and 20% of the LNG, liquefied natural gas, were being exported through the Strait of Hormuz. And now that has dropped around 5% of the normal level. So this is the biggest disruption to the oil and the LNG supply to the global market in the modern history. So just let's remember, there have been several major refineries, gas plants, the export terminals that have been attacked by Iran in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in United Arab Emirates, including Ras Laffan gas plants in Qatar and Ras Tanura and Yanbu energy facilities in Saudi Arabia. So now, compared to the beginning of the war, before the war, what is happening, what is being flown to the international market is just a trickle. And now Saudi Arabia is trying to increase its western coastal production. So simply getting the energy from the east to the west to a safer area and export it through the Red Sea. And they're saying that they have increased that capacity of east-west pipeline from 2 million barrels of oil per day to 7 million. However, still compared to the pre-war area, it is just a trickle.
Russell, it's pretty evident that there's some sort of talks going on in some shape or fashion, but mainly involving third party, it seems.
Indeed, so for this part of the world, so the diplomatic efforts are at two tracks. The first one is the GCC as a cooperation bloc, and then the regional level. So for GCC, it has its own weaknesses. So despite being a cooperation organization here, you see that the members of these cooperation have different approaches when it comes how to respond to that. And that's why we, particularly in the last week, we're seeing the diplomatic efforts intensify to provide a unified position here. Qatari Emir was in Saudi Arabia the day before, and then he went to the United Arab Emirates, and today the Kuwaiti foreign minister is now in Riyadh. So all of them are a search to how to respond to this crisis collectively. So they have their concerns. First, of course, they want to be at a table, if there's going to be a negotiating table, and now they want the energy, the flow of energy to be secured, and of course Iran's proxies and also the missiles program, that it's being seen as a threat. When it comes to the regional countries, then Saudi Arabia, the Turks and the Pakistanis and Egyptians are involved in these diplomatic efforts, and they are concerned about the economy, about the instability of the borders, and also they want to contain the war. So in that sense, these two levels of the diplomatic engagements are continuing. However, as of now, still it's difficult to say that they are representing a solid bloc.
Russell, thank you for that. Russell Serder there in Riyadh. Well, let's try and see where we're at. Joined now by Paul Musgrave, who's an associate professor at Georgetown University here in Qatar, also a US foreign policy analyst. Welcome, Paul. And Danya Thalfa, who's the executive director of Gulf International Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C., also a lecturer at Georgetown University. Welcome to both of you. And Danya, I'd like to start with you. So all eyes on Donald Trump's pronouncements later when he makes this address to the nation. Do you hold out any hope that we're at the point at which we might open a door to resolution?
You know, it's hard to say, because from Trump's perspective, I think, you know, the best way to look at it is war is deception to him, and he likes to have different cards that he can play. And as you can see, his messaging has changed from day to day, hour to hour. So it's hard to follow. But I think that President Trump would likely frame this war as a success. And as he has been doing, narrowing the objectives and redefining the objectives to fit in the frame of what they've achieved so far in this war. However, I don't think